A few months ago, I had a great conversation with Jeff Turner of Dunsky, but unfortunately, we had audio troubles. I don't know what happened, but we had to take that podcast down, and Jeff graciously agreed to re record today's session. So today, we're going to continue talking about EVs and EV adoption, things like barriers to the adoption side of things, but also how to turn gas powered fleets into electric ones, and how the grid has to get ready, and how this all has to become a strategy of some sorts. Jeff is going to talk about electric vehicles and how they have different usage types. Say, for example, fire trucks and ferries, or even vehicles have different uses and different purposes. So we're going to understand these profiles a little bit better and how to better develop better EV strategies. So get ready again for Jeff. Hi, Jeff. Thanks for joining me again.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on.
Well, let's hear about your background. I mean, you've got a really great, industry experience, in the energy field. So, what led you to Dunsky?
Um, yeah, it's a great question. And actually, yeah, my career in electric mobility started way back in 2005. I was an undergrad student. I was still a student at the time, but that's when I first got into this exciting space. Some friends of mine invited me to come help them work on an electric snowmobile project
Mm-hmm.
at McGill University. I was studying mechanical engineering, and yeah, there was a student design competition organized by the Society of Automotive Engineers. A bunch of other Canadian and U.S. universities were building gas-powered snowmobiles that were, maybe a bit cleaner and quieter. They had catalytic converters, things like
Yeah.
that. And McGill was the first school to show up with a fully electric snowmobile, and so we were kind of off the charts on a lot of the competition metrics and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was the start, and it's really amazing to think back to then when electric vehicles were very much more of a science project. Had a lot of fun building prototype vehicles and racing them and things like that. But then, yeah, since then I've had a chance to work for companies that were selling electric vehicles, designing them, both in London, UK, and out in Vancouver. And then I also had a chance to work for BC Hydro from 2012 to 2016. Yeah, working on the first public charging infrastructure that was going in the ground back then. We had a network of 30 fast chargers for EVs and 500 level 2 chargers. And yeah, it gave me a chance to really see what it's like to put this infrastructure in the ground,
Yeah.
testing out different technologies, including a lot of things that'll help utilities handle the growing load on the grid and things like that. But yeah, and then I joined the team at Dunsky in 2017, and up to that point, Dunsky had been around since the early 2000s, doing a lot of work on energy efficiency in buildings and renewable energy, and I helped the company dive into the wonderful world of clean transportation. Um, Sorry, I'm getting a message that's telling me that it's trying to reconnect and asking me if I have a stable connection. I don't know if you're seeing that as well.
Awesome. So, around the area of awareness and education, how do you help your clients understand like the financial, advantages, to adopting EVs? Because it can be expensive. It's a bit of an investment up front. So, how do you go about that?
Sure. And Maria, I just wanted to double check that you're hearing me okay, because I had a message there saying it was trying to reconnect.
Oh,
Are
here
you
we
still
go.
hearing me?
Yeah, maybe I'll ask that question again. It
Sure.
looks like
Okay.
it's good
Sounds
again.
good.
All right. So around the area of awareness and education, how do you help your clients understand the financial advantages to EV adoption? Because it can be an investment. It can be costly. So how do you go around that?
Yeah, I'd say we tackle this on sort of two different levels because, so our work, we're generally working for governments and utilities that are trying to figure out what kind of a role they can play in this transition and how they can accelerate adoption of electric vehicles. Sometimes that's within their own operations. Maybe it's a government or utility that has their own fleet of vehicles,
Hmm.
private companies as well. And in those cases, sometimes we're helping them to develop a plan that makes the case for investment in electric vehicles. And it's all about getting a sense of, what is it going to involve in terms of those upfront capital investments
Mm-hmm.
for the vehicles and the charging infrastructure. But what's the prize at the end of the tunnel in terms of reduced operational costs? And I think for those fleet customers, we're in luck because a lot of fleets, do a lot of this kind of analysis and using spreadsheets to look at the total cost of ownership, and that really helps make a pretty compelling case for electric vehicles. But for the other side of the work, which is actually the majority of our work, is when we're helping governments and utilities understand the potential for transitioning to EVs region wide, not just in their own operations, but say for a provincial government, how do they accelerate adoption across the whole province?
Mm-hmm.
And there again, this question of awareness and understanding of the financial implications of switching to an EV are very important. We all know that EVs currently cost more upfront. They might save you in the long run, depending on what type of driving you do. But average people are much less likely to use a spreadsheet to calculate their total cost of ownership. We know that personal vehicle decisions are a lot less rational and scientific. Folks are looking at that upfront sticker price. And so I think beyond looking at just the total cost of ownership, that's certainly a part of the puzzle. Certainly, governments across the country are doing their best to improve the awareness and do a lot of education around those types of benefits of EVs. But at the same time, we know that upfront cost is really an important barrier to adoption. And so I think that's where, for some of our clients, whether it's governments at the federal level or provincial level, things like financial incentives are a really important piece of the puzzle to help deal with that upfront cost, at least temporarily, while the cost of these vehicles is still, significantly higher than comparable gas-powered vehicles.
Definitely. Forecasting models, they can be, region specific. The Atlantic Canada can differ from Western Canada. How can that be? It's something to do with load profiles you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things
Yeah.
at play here. I'd say, I'll talk about load profiles in a minute, but
Mm-hmm.
just in terms of the potential for adoption of EVs in different parts of the country, um, I think that's where we look at, what are some region-specific barriers to adoption, and so that can be things like whether we're focused on very urban environments or more sort of rural areas, which have very different implications in terms of charging infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people, their first reaction is to think that EVs are really a city thing, and
Right.
rural folks would have a harder time. I actually disagree with that. I live on a farm. I think EVs are great for folks that live in rural areas because we drive a lot. And so back to that economic argument, we're actually doing pretty well in terms of that potential long-term savings, because every kilometer you drive, you're saving a lot by switching to electric, to an EV. And it becomes just a question of, how do we make sure that there's enough public charging infrastructure to cover the longer distances that you might see in a rural environment. Contrast that with an urban environment where access to charging is much more complicated. If you live in a rural area, you probably have a driveway. Much less likely to be the case if you're in, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, places like that. And so we do a lot of work with those local governments. And I'd say with those bigger cities, those challenges around access to charging are really top of mind. And yeah, beyond that, there's also just questions about the demographics, and certainly, at this stage in the game, we see that with EVs being more expensive upfront to buy, certainly the hotspots for EV adoption are more the more affluent parts of the country, and so factors like that can really have an impact on the potential for adoption. But on the side of load profiles, that's sort of the next step, especially when we're working with electric utilities that are trying to understand what are the implications for their operations, how much load is this going to represent for them going forward. That's where we really need to take into account, what are the travel patterns in different parts of the country? How far do people drive? Climate certainly has a big impact as well, because at colder temperatures, EVs
Yeah.
consume a lot more energy. And so these are some of the important factors that we need to take into account when figuring out where and when do these vehicles charge, and what does it mean for the electric utility.
No EV is the same. I mean, if you're comparing a fire truck or an ambulance to, a regular, car that you and I would just drive. I mean, how do you help provincial and federal municipal governments, create these usage profiles? I guess that's what we're kind of leaning into is no EV is the same, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you nailed it by speaking to some of those commercial types of vehicles. I mean, I think for our personal vehicles, my comments on the last question about load profiles,
Mm-hmm.
maybe there's some variability from one place to the next, but generally speaking, most personal vehicles are doing some variation of driving to work and back a couple times a week,
Right.
and then maybe going on the occasional long trip. And so there's variation in there for sure. But when you look at commercial vehicles, different types of trucks and buses, that's where the usage patterns begin to be very specific and very unique. And it becomes really
Mm-hmm.
important to consider those usage profiles carefully when assessing the potential for adoption of electric vehicles. So we do that again when we're looking at the potential for adoption region wide, maybe developing these load forecasts for an electric utility. We'll take a close look at what is the composition of the fleet in their service territory. And also, when we're working for an individual fleet, for example, we do a lot of work for local governments, and local governments have large fleets, and they're very diverse. They have a lot of different types of vehicles. They have, anything from a small passenger car that's doing parking enforcement, all the way up to fire trucks and garbage
Hmm.
trucks and everything in between. And so we pay a lot of attention to how these vehicles are used. Sometimes working with companies like Geotab that have devices on the vehicles that collect telematics data that can tell you a lot
Yeah.
about where and how much driving these vehicles do, and that can be really valuable for understanding the potential for adoption of an EV for a given application, understanding whether that vehicle is really suitable for replacement with an EV. B, what the potential fuel savings would look like and how that compares to the upfront cost. And crucially, also gives us a sense of what the energy demand of that vehicle will be. So, for an individual fleet, that might be really critical to understand what kind of charging infrastructure they need to install in their facilities and how that might compare to their available electrical capacity. And at the utility scale, that's going to tell them a lot about, well, what's it going to be like when 100% of the school buses and transit buses go electric over the next 10 years or so, and
Right.
what is it going to look like when a warehouse supporting a fleet of 100 class 8 semi trucks goes electric. That careful understanding of those usage profiles is really important to perform that assessment of the overall energy demand for fleet electrification.
So once you get all this data collected and you're crunching all the numbers and you're looking at all the reports, what does an EV strategy look like, in general terms?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say it really depends on the organization, because we do work for electric utilities for different levels of government, anywhere from city governments, state and provincial governments, all the way up to the federal government. And we also do work for corporate organizations that are either looking to invest in the EV transition, or that perhaps just for their own operations they want to understand how to decarbonize their fleet. So across the board, I think the common theme is that we need to understand the objectives.
Right.
In general, if it's an EV strategy, I assume the objective is going to be something along the lines of maximize adoption of EVs, either in our own operations or region wide. And to do that, you really need to understand what are the barriers to adoption of EVs.
Mm.
And so there are a lot of things. I think I try to strike a balance. In general, I'm pretty optimistic about the potential for the switch to EVs. I think we're seeing a lot of progress.
Hmm.
You might see some headlines that are pretty gloomy, but I think if you look at the numbers, it seems like the trajectory is obvious. We're seeing incredible growth in EV adoption, but I like to balance that optimism out with a pretty clear-eyed appreciation of the real barriers that are holding still a significant portion of the population, holding them back in terms of making that switch to an EV. And so we do a lot of work to develop a really good understanding of what exactly are those barriers, and that's crucial to understand what are the steps that different levels of government or other organizations can take to address those barriers. Um, and different levels of government, for example, might have different strengths in terms of their position in the market and what kind of a role they can play. I would say, city governments, they're really down on the ground, really in a good position to help grasp the specific barriers to charging in their specific environment. So they might understand, what does the city look like? What are the different neighborhoods, and where do people park, and what types of public infrastructure might be useful in different areas. Whereas all the way at the other end of the spectrum, the federal government, we do a lot of work in Canada for the federal government. And, I wouldn't say they're in a good position to figure out exactly what charging stations should go where, because, they're not going to, they should be leaving that to folks who are down on the ground. But they've got a really important role to play in terms of supporting things, certainly from the financial side, providing funding for charging infrastructure. And also, we mentioned earlier the role of financial rebates for
Yeah.
the purchase of EVs in the near term. And provincial governments somewhere in between those two ends of the spectrum have a lot of different roles they can play as well. And so I think it's a matter of looking at and understanding those barriers to adoption, working with our clients to understand what's within their wheelhouse, what can they really take on themselves, and using that, putting that all together to come up with a strategy that can really help to address those barriers. So a really good example is last year, the Quebec government announced an EV infrastructure strategy. And so
Yeah.
we did all the analysis on that strategy to figure out what kind of infrastructure is needed, what's it going to take, and help them focus their efforts and appreciate the scale of ambition that's required. And so that strategy includes over $500 million of new funding for charging infrastructure. And so, we have a lot of fun really helping them figure out how to make the most of their capacity and how they can have the greatest impact.
Awesome. Well, in December of 2023, Ella, we both know, the federal government announced that by 2035, 100% full adoption of EVs in Canada. So, what does this mean for utilities, let's say, and the grid and the infrastructure? I mean, that's a pretty substantial target to reach. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
I think, first of all, there's one point of confusion that I think is really important to address. And sometimes that target gets discussed and people misinterpret it
Mm-hmm.
to think that that means that 100% of the vehicles on the road must be electric by
Right.
2035. That's
But new
not at all what's
sales
being.
or something. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And those are two very different
Mm-hmm.
things. So that means that as of 2035, you can no longer buy a new gas
Right.
powered vehicle, but we'll still have gas powered vehicles on the road probably till about 2050. So as far as that planning goes for electric utilities, some people ask the sort of the straw man argument: can the grid handle all the vehicles being electric? And almost suggesting like that's going to happen
Mm-hmm.
overnight. What's working in the favor of the electric utilities is that it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time. Even once we hit that target of 100% of new sales in 2035, utilities will still have another 15 years or so before every vehicle on a driveway in Canada is going to be plugging into the grid. But I don't want to underplay the challenge here. It is pretty substantial, and there's a lot of work to be done on the utility side. We work with utilities in just about every province, developing load forecasts to understand, how quickly is this load going to materialize? And if anything, those targets that have been adopted by the federal government really help electric utilities in terms of knowing what they need to plan for. I think until, we've been doing this kind of forecasting since about 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And in the early days, there are a lot of questions. We would do our best to develop forecasts, but there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether this trajectory was really going to happen. Now that you have a federal target that's locked in, it really helps the utilities and the decision makers at utilities, and also the regulators that need to approve utility plans. It helps them really recognize that this transition is on its way and that we should be taking steps proactively to anticipate that. But I would say in general, when we work with these utilities, they there are challenges ahead. They're going to need to do some work in terms of expanding capacity in certain parts of the grid. But if anything, they see EVs as honestly one of the easy challenges ahead of them, because EVs are inherently very flexible. And what I mean by that is that you come home with an EV, you plug it in maybe at 5 or 6 p.m.
I
but you generally don't need a full charge until the next morning. And with people typically driving about 40, 50, 60 kilometers a day, on a level 2 charger, you only need about an hour or two of charging per day. And so there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of flexibility in terms of when that charging can happen, and a lot of potential for utilities to encourage off peak charging. And if anything, turn EVs into a net benefit for the grid in terms of increasing usage of the grid assets, increasing the revenue for the utilities without necessarily driving higher costs. And looking a little bit further into the future, potentially even being able to leverage these EVs as a distributed form of energy storage. And so, if utilities can figure out the right programs and policies, they might be able to encourage EV owners with some kind of financial incentive to allow the utility to tap into that energy storage during peak periods, and help use that kind of storage to accommodate an increasing penetration of variable renewable sources of generation. So I think in general, I mean, the quick answer to this to me is go to just about any electric utility website in the country, and you're likely to find some page on their website that tells you how awesome EVs are. And that wouldn't be the case if utilities were really concerned about the impact of EVs on the grid. I think overall they see a lot of potential here, and it's just a question about staying ahead of the curve and making sure they're prepared for this load growth as it picks up.
Awesome. I seem to have lost you there for a quick second, but you know what? I'll just, we can edit this, but I think it's recording you and you're speaking, and it's recording me in a separate track. So I think we're okay. But
Okay,
well,
great.
thank
Yeah, and if ever it helps,
you.
I also set up my phone just to be recording me as well,
Yeah,
if ever you need a backup.
that's great. That's good. Well, Jeff, thanks so much for speaking with me today again. And we're going to make
Yeah,
this happen. We're
absolutely.
going to make this work. You certainly.
Yeah,
I love this topic about EVs, and I like the work that you're doing at Dunsky, and what Dunsky is doing as well. And we'll be meeting again for sure. We'll be crossing paths for sure.
that sounds great. No, and thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for putting a spotlight on this topic.
You're welcome. Okay, take care.
That was Jeff Turner, Director of Mobility with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors, talking about EV adoption and strategy and everything else about the EV industry. Great conversation. Thanks for listening and joining in. This podcast is sponsored by Smart Energy. It's an energy conference that's held in Halifax and Vancouver, and it's where people get together, academia, the industry, and also curious people who just want to learn more about what's going on in the energy world. We hope that you can register. I'm your host, Maria McGowan. Thanks for listening in today, and we'll see you or talk to you, or you can listen to me next time. Have a great day.